Hi, welcome back. This is the sixth segment, final segment of our video sessions. This one we're going to use to talk about John Keats, a poet of the Romantic period. Other poets we've looked at include William Blake, William Wordsworth, a couple of other famous poets, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, also a Romantic poet. These are considered the six major Romantic poets, although there are dozens and dozens more from this time period who were really wonderful poets. I would like to talk a little bit about John Keats's life. Keats is up there alongside Walt Whitman amongst my very favorite poets. Poets I think transcend the art form. They are larger than you might imagine that poetry can achieve. Keats is a particular case for me. I think he is celebrated in part so much because of his youth and how soon he accomplished all that he accomplished. No other poet from any country, from any time period, achieved a similar success, not commercial success, but artistic success. No one else achieved the heights that Keats achieved at such a young age. Keats died when he was only 25 years old. Everything that we've read by him, everything that he published, pretty much written by age 23, because he was very ill for the last year and a half of his life, and he did very little writing. So you look at the other great poets. You can look at Chaucer, Milton, Shakespeare. You can look at Dante. You can look at the great Japanese and Chinese poets. No one achieved anything close to what Keats achieved by the age that he achieved it. It's pretty remarkable when you say, anytime you can say not even Shakespeare, you're in an uncharted territory there. So I want to say just a little bit about Keats's life, and I hope that you'll look at the anthology along with me. I'm on page 342. And there's a short biographical sketch about Keats. There's a quote here from the American poet T.S. Eliot, who says that the 251 letters Keats left behind are, quote, the most important ever written by any English poet. So we're going to look at Keats's letters, or a couple of them, as well as his poems. A little further down on that page, I'd like for you to look at the last paragraph on that page that says, as you begin to look for patterns in Keats's poems, you may notice that many of them focus on encounters with classical art. We're going to talk about one of those, the Grecian urn. Take their subjects from classical sources or allude to classical literature and myth. So we'll see all of this in the poems coming up. Likewise, you will want to think about the implications of Keats's choice to work with traditional poetic forms, especially the sonnet and the ode. Keats somewhat jokingly suggested that he needed such forms in order to restrain the headlong impetuosity of his muse. So among the great beauties of the world, ancient artifacts, traditional forms, I'm at the top of 343 here, rank high on Keats's list, right? So he thinks of poetic form as an item of beauty. Little further down on that page, yet Keats's poetry just as powerfully evokes the beauty of ordinary, living, natural things, of, quote, the sun, the moon, trees, and simple sheep. So you can see that Keats's mind wasn't only in the clouds. It wasn't only in the constellations. He thought about everyday life as well. And it may be that what's so effective about his work is that fusing of the cosmic with the ordinary, the far out with the up close. So one of my professors once talked about metaphor and how metaphor works in poetry. Now, by this time, we will have already talked about it. If you want to flip to your glossary, just for a moment to get a reminder on what metaphor means. It is one thing pictured as if it were something else, suggesting a likeness or analogy between them. And then the second definition, I think this is very important, an implicit comparison or identification with one thing, of one thing with another unlike itself. Simile is used like or as. Those are the verbal signals to say that you're creating an analogy, a simile. Similes are explicit. They point out directly to you what the connections are between this thing and that thing. Metaphors are implicit. They're much harder to do, really, and sometimes even harder to recognize. So one of my professors, I was going to say, talked about poetry as the art of the near and the far. So this is how metaphor works. A metaphor can take something that is very far out on the periphery, something that we may not be very familiar with, compare it with, make an analogy with something very close to us that we see often, and the effect is that thing that is very far away is then brought in closer to us so that we can understand it better or see it more clearly. An equally interesting converse effect is the thing that's very close to us, maybe the thing that we see all the time, possibly we take it for granted, possibly we don't even think about it very much, we don't even see it anymore. A really good metaphor, a really good analogy can make that thing less familiar, strange even, and thus we can see it in a new light. The thing that is over-familiar we might be able to see with fresh eyes again because of an effective metaphor. So Keats was a master at the metaphor. We're going to be reading all of these Keats poems and thinking about the sonnet form of On Seeing the Elgin Marbles. I will post a couple of images of the Elgin Marbles. I will post some images to go along with the Ode on a Grecian Urn, including a drawing that Keats himself did of a Grecian urn. That poem is on page 347, and I'll remind you, I showed you this in an earlier video, but my book looks like this. I hope you can see all of the blue ink of my handwriting on the page there. I make lots of notes in my books, especially the ones I'm going to use for class. That way I can just sort of keep everything together. I can keep all my thoughts together. I also have handwritten notes, sometimes even typed notes. Some of those I'll make available to you. Some of those are just for my own use. Let's look at Ode on a Grecian Urn. It is possibly the most famous of Keats's odes. It confronts some of the eternal questions and even problems of art. So I don't think that I want to read the entire poem because it's several sections long, but I'd like to read just the opening stanza, section 1, and we'll just get a sense for the rhythm and the form. Now remember, Keats is a formal poet. He's a formalist poet, and so he has a specific ode form in mind. He has a particular rhyme scheme and metrical pattern. I hope that by this point you'll be able to identify what those are. Ode on a Grecian Urn. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals, or of both? In Tempe or the dales of Arcady, what men or gods are these? What maidens loathe? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? The first section ends with just a whole series of questions. This is not unlike The Tiger by William Blake, a poem that's driven by its questions, questions for which there really are no answers. That's part of what the point of this poem becomes, is that whatever was inscribed on these urns, an urn, think of an urn as like a vase or a big flower pot or something. If you haven't seen a visual on it yet, think of the urn as it's both decorative and functional. And one of the questions is that on this Greek statuary art, we may not always know the references. We may not always know to what myth or deity or ritual the image makes reference. So in this first section, let me just go over a couple things with you. We see both assonance and alliteration. I'm thinking of silence and slow time. We get the long I sound, child, silence, time for assonance. We get the S's of the S inside Foster, beginning of silence, beginning of slow, and the L's as well, the internal alliteration of the L's in silence and slow create, and then those pick up again in Sylvan in the next line. So you can hear these almost like chiming effects of the language. It's very musical, really. Keats is one of the most musical of poets. So there is great beauty in that effect. A Sylvan historian. This is an interesting phrase. It basically means a historian of the woods. Sylvan refers to a woodland or a meadow, which is typically not a peopled place, not usually thought of as having a history. We think of history as the history of people. And so he's talking about a Sylvan, the speaker is talking about a Sylvan historian, a historian of the woods. This is one of the many things that the urn can do. There's a paradox in section 2 of this poem with heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. In other words, the image of the music of the musicians on the urn creates in our mind a sweeter music even than that we can hear with our ears. To the sensual ear, he says, the ear that we actually hear with. There are the lovers who cannot kiss, never canst thou kiss, he says. They are pictured on the urn, and they are so close together. They are so near winning the goal, he says, which is the consummation of their passion, of their feeling. And he says, don't worry about this, because you will be preserved forever in this blissful moment of being just about to come together. Now, I think that's kind of a cold comfort, because they never can actually get together, but they will always be in that moment of that about to moment. To the speaker, this is much greater than actual love and actual life, which of course changes, right? The lovers will never love each other any less. They will never get old, and their beauty will never fade. So they will be forever preserved in this blissful state of almost perfection. There's a central question at the end of this poem, and it's a question that goes back to Plato, even, and the ancient Greeks, about truth and beauty and their relationship. Now, I want you to think a little bit, and this is certainly something we'll have discussions about. Who's speaking those last two lines of the poem? and what is that message of what you know and what you need to know. Now, I want to bring in a reference here. I like this book a lot, The Odes of John Keats, by the scholar Helen Vindler, and I might make reference to it in some of our discussions. There are many great works of criticism about Keats's poetry. His poetry is inexhaustible. You can read it and read it and read it, and you can find new connections, and especially when you read like the sequence of the odes together, you'll find new relationships between them every time you read them. So I think you can never exhaust what they mean. Helen Vindler says, "The Ode on a Grecian Urn squarely confronts the truth that art is not, quote, natural, like leaves on a tree, but artificial." Artificial, notice the same root there. "The sculptor must chisel the stone, a medium external to himself. In restricting itself to one sense, the urn resembles the Nightingale poem, which we will have just read. But in the urn, the sense is sight, not hearing." So Keats is using different senses, focusing on different senses for different poems. Those two, I think, are particularly interesting to look at together, the Nightingale and the Grecian urn. I want to turn attention now to probably my favorite Keats poem. If I were compiling the anthology that I referenced a couple segments ago, that placed William Blake's The Tiger as the #1 classic poem out of the Classic 100, John Keats's To Autumn would probably be my #1. I think this is just about a perfect poem. I think it has the most beautiful opening line in all of poetry. So let's take a look at just a brief look, because we'll want to spend some discussion time on this poem, at To Autumn on page 350. To Autumn by John Keats. "Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd, to plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more, and still more, later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has overbrimmed their clammy cells." This is just the fullness, the abundance of autumn. This is a section about, this part of the poem is about natural processes. This is the fullness of the season. Autumn is the time of harvest. It's the time of reaping what you sow, of basically claiming the spoils of all the hard work of spring and summer. Autumn is also a time of some bittersweet feeling. In autumn, you know winter's coming, right? This is what we get in the third section with the songs of spring. Keats says the songs of autumn, the music of autumn, is just as lovely as the music of springtime. Although we know that winter's coming, we enjoy the fullness of autumn. And this is a further way of saying that each season has its own beauty. Now, following this poem are some excerpts from Keats's letters. There's one of particular importance that I want you to look at, and it's on page 352. It's his letter to George and Thomas Keats, his brothers, from December of 1817. And for two reasons. About 8 lines down, you see the relationship of truth and beauty. So this is this is continued thinking about that major question about art, and two of Plato's three elements of truth, beauty. The third is goodness or love. And Keats wants to look at King Lear by William Shakespeare, his great play, possibly his greatest play. And he says, examine King Lear and you will find this exemplified throughout. And then he's referring to a painting, which I hope that you'll take a moment to look up what it looks like. Then a little further down that page, about 10 lines from the bottom, he says, I had not a dispute, but a disquisition with Dilke on various subjects. This is, in other words, he's having a conversation with his friend. Not exactly an argument, but they are sort of pressing a subject. They're trying to explore this subject together. And he says, several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. So put a mark beside this. I mean negative capability. That is when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So for Keats, this is one of the keys to, this is the key element to great art, is that it can withstand being subject to uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts. In other words, great art may not give you all the answers, but it examines those questions that are of ultimate importance, of ultimate consequence. I think that you'll be able to apply that term, negative capability, to Keats's poems, but also retroactively to several poems that we've read during this semester, including poems by Sylvia Plath and by William Blake, and even more contemporary poets that we've read. Think back to the Evan Boland poem about irony that we looked at. So that's one of the sort of central statements from the Romantic period, and really in all of English literature, about the nature of great art, that it does not always provide simple answers, because life's most pressing questions, life's most difficult circumstances and situations don't often yield simple answers. So I think you've probably concluded, as I have, that John Keats had an amazing intellect and an astonishing grasp of the world for one so young. And I hope you've enjoyed these poems. I hope that you've enjoyed reading all the poems for class. We still have some poems to go, although this will be the final of the video segments for the semester. So good luck, enjoy the last days of summer, and see you at the final.